Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we pride ourselves on this channel in covering the less famous divisions in the ETO and in the Pacific. We honored the 106th last week, and today we do the same for the 70th. That's the American 70th US Infantry Division, who were fighting in Germany 80 years ago. This is one of the units that really began their campaign right in what many people consider the kind of the closing chapter when it's all done and dusted. But as we'll find out, far from done and dusted if you were actually serving in the ETO in the spring of 1945. So Josh was last on giving us a presentation about Wake Island. So it's 3 years have passed, and we've leapt forward, whatever that is, 4 years in the war. So good afternoon, Josh. Josh, how are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me on. Looking forward to it.
So we're going to dive straight in with this. I mean, it's a family connection. We love it when people have that direct connection with a unit like this, and it's honestly, that's one of the reasons why some of the, and we shouldn't really say lesser known, then, or they're just, some are better known. But it's people who have a connection, who bother to make websites, who bother to put the morning reports online. I'm thinking about Myra and the work she does with the 83rd. And you were just saying there's a fantastic 7th Division website out there, and it needs doers to make sure these units are not forgotten, because the archival information exists. It's just someone's got to be the one to kind of put it together.
Yeah, exactly. And like I was telling you before, when I came across, I've known about this website for quite some time, and it's, like I said, it's active. When I was doing my research on it, there was just endless. I mean, there's probably stuff that I still haven't come across. I mean, right down from each individual unit, right from the infantry down to the artillery. I mean, right through. It's just a comprehensive history of the 70th Infantry Division, and every little detail in between where they were, and there were just detailed reports. The website, before I forget, it's Trailblazers, WWII.org.
Okay.
Go there. It's they do just a fantastic job. I think they're actively involved in it. They're constantly updating and adding new things all the time. It's a great resource for any research and any information involved there.
Anyway, thank you for the plug, and we will get going. So over to you, Josh, and fire away with questions, folks. But I think a lot of the information will be kind of covered as Josh takes us through this story, and it'll take them from their formation right up to the fighting in Germany. So over to you, sir.
So there's a great game that maybe many Americans remember growing up. I certainly do in junior high, called Oregon Trail. And it's the story about, it begins in the early 1800s, goes to the mid 1840s. Basically, the trail that went from Independence, Missouri, across Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, into the Willamette Valley of Oregon. And this is really where the Trailblazers will be, really the inspiration will be known from. So the insignia itself, the red, white, and green shoulder patch, it bears an axe that it's in recognition of these pioneers who traveled to Oregon during the fur trade in the early 1800s. It was only passable by horseback and foot. Over time, they widened those trails, and eventually it would become, and the game itself is interesting. You have to do things to keep the horses fed, the people fed in case people had injuries. You had to find medicines, and people would die along the way of snake bites and this type of thing. And people remember the game. It's pretty interesting. So for the 70th, their beginnings in the Willamette Valley in what's known as Camp Adair. The snowy mountain on the patch is Oregon's Mount Hood, which the fir tree, the green tree there, symbolizes the 91st Infantry Division, the Fir Tree Division, from which many of the officers and NCOs of the 70th that were attached there were drawn from that particular division. So go to the next slide. So I sort of broke it down, and I think the story of the 70th itself in Europe when they reached the ETO in 1944 into 1945 can sort of be broken down to 3 different phases, from the time when the Germans broke through in Operation Nordwind on New Year's Eve of 1944 to 1945. So it begins when the Trailblazers get to Marseille, France, unloading there. Then they begin the slow reinforced pushback of the Germans along the entire, or it's around a 70-mile front that they're operating in through the towns of Philipsburg, Wingen-sur-Moder, Barenthal. Then they make the swing up into what's known as the Spicheren Heights, or the Battle of the Ridges, into Forbach, Spicheren Heights, that particular battle, steering Vendel, and then really the final phase is the actual drive into Germany, into the town of Saarbrücken, which is just across the Saar River, which will be really their ultimate destination. So activated as the 70th Infantry Division at Camp Adair, this will take place on June 15th, 1943, Infantry Day. So the Trailblazers, many people think of, the NBA team, and this is, again, the Oregon Trail, and this is really where it's derived from. So this division would serve in the ETO, being activated when they would return in October of 1945. So the 70th operated as what is known as a triangular division, a group of infantry organized into three separate regiments. The regiments were the 274th, the 275th, and the 276th. They will be responsible for really the bulk of the fighting that takes place during their time there. So each regiment had 3 battalions, each with 4 companies. The 70th was one of the few divisions that had an artillery or cannon company, an anti-tank company, and a service company, as well as a medical detachment for each regiment. So Camp Adair in the Willamette Valley is in northwestern Oregon in the Pacific Northwest. It was really the site of what were known as 25 new cantonments constructed in the United States for the U.S. Army between 1940 and 1942. So these cantonments were characterized as sort of speedy construction, low-cost temporary buildings designed to house men and train them quickly. So the reservation with over 56,000 acres at Adair, 4 infantry divisions would train there, as you saw. So from its peak from 1942 to 44, 2 divisions were training there at the same time. Adair had a population of around 40,000, which would actually make it the second largest city in all of the state of Oregon. So recruits would largely come from Pennsylvania, Minnesota, New York, Ohio, Missouri. They would really learn their first hard lessons in training in the hilly valleys in this area. If you notice on this map, there's a large sort of dark area off to the left side of the actual camp itself. So for Band of Brothers fans out there, they'll appreciate this. So that spot right there is called Coffin Butte, and it's sort of similar to Currahee Mountain, the 3 miles up, 3 miles down. So they trained on that particular spot. I know it's changed elevations. I think it's around 10 or 11,000 feet or something to that effect. So this was really, the 70th version of Currahee Mountain. So training would continue there in July of 1944, going into the division, undergoing final testing, engaging in mock battles with the 96th and 104th Divisions. In late July of 1944, the division was now ordered to move from Oregon to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And finally, in late December, basic training was over. The 13-week training period had ended, and many of these tests that were given to the 7th, again, by the 4th Army Division, they had succeeded with a 95% passing of the test. So, they had really been well-trained, well-conditioned, and the conditions, the topography is extremely rugged there. There's, it's hills, mountains, forests, heavily wooded areas. So getting acclimated to these types of conditions at Adair in this particular part of the United States, I think really prepared them well for the types of adverse conditions that they were going to be facing once they arrived, again, smack in the middle of one of the worst winters on record. And
another nail in the coffin of the stupid idea that the units that arrive later in the war are less trained, green, don't know what they're doing. I mean, they're green in the sense they haven't had combat, but they are a product of everything the US Army has learned about training men since 41 onwards. And so, the units that were mobilized in 41, 42 had to sometimes go to camps that hadn't been built yet, and the procedures of how to train them are sort of still stuck in the pre-war era. This is the product of a modern army that has learned how to do things. And I think the tired old writing about these units arriving as if they're somehow not on a par with the early units. I think it's so annoying.
And you make a great point, and I think this is in the 70th case. That's really rings really true. And as Major General John Dahlquist will say, the division commander, in critiquing and observing the 70th in their training sessions, saying that basic training will never end until the war is over and we're demobilized. So this was the mentality of their commanders. So to get into the command structure, John Dahlquist was, he was revered by his men. He loved the infantry, respected by the infantrymen. Again, he kept up an excellent training program at Camp Adair when he joined there in July of 1944. And before that, I should say. So he didn't command the division in combat, but his influence and impact on the division was felt all throughout its tenure. So he was a 2-star general. He organized the Trailblazers in 1943, and by the time he was done, he was a 4-star general. So he was a veteran of both world wars, some of the highest military posts. He led the 36th Infantry Division, the Texas Division, at victories at Cassino and Salerno during the hard fighting in the Italian campaign, then into France. He then returned to the United States in 1943. He became Deputy Chief of Staff to Dwight Eisenhower, and after leading the 70th to this fighting fitness and getting it up to strength, he would return to command the 36th. So his division, actually, as I'll get to in a moment, captured a number of high-ranking Nazi officials, as I'll explain in a moment. Major General Allison Barnett was a Kentucky-born man. He was enlisted at 15 years old as a buck private in the Kentucky National Guard. He was discharged as a sergeant in 1913. He had a broad military career. During World War I, he enlisted and was commissioned a captain in the 3rd Kentucky Infantry. So during World War II, he was assigned to the Army Air Force as a chief of staff for the Western Defense Command. And then he would return to, in 1944, he would go into the Blue Helmets, the 93rd Division, under Major General Charles P. Hall. They would fight at Bougainville in the Pacific. So just after Pearl Harbor, he was then sent to New Caledonia as chief of staff of the armies in the South Pacific, and then he would take command of the 70th Infantry Division at Fort Leonard Wood in 1944. If you can go to the next slide. So here is John Dahlquist with none other than Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering after the Germans surrendered in May of 1945. So the 36th Division under his command were responsible not only for capturing Goering, also included Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, as well as General Sepp Dietrich, two of Hitler's generals who probably hadn't fallen out of favor, not as badly as most of the other ones had. So I know Hitler and Sepp Dietrich were quite close. And in the final days of the war, the 36th Infantry Division would operate not really far from the Trailblazers' right flank. So it was almost if while they were in combat, it's almost if they'd felt that Dahlquist was somehow still there watching over them. And I'm sure that made a pretty big impact on the men there. You go to the next slide. So two other important commanders who were training there were Thomas Herron. He was, again, another 2 World War commander. He was also in the Korean War from 1950 to 53. He rose to the rank of commanding general of the First Army. And after graduating high school in Alabama in 1914, he would eventually teach school in Alabama, then enter the Army Enlisted Candidate School in Fort McPherson, Georgia, commissioned as a second lieutenant in August of 1917, involved in field artillery. So then he was assigned to France in the 78th Field Artillery Battalion as an executive officer. And following Germany's surrender in November of 1918, he remained in Europe as part of the occupation force. So following this in 1942, after World War II had began for the U.S., he'd been promoted to the rank of colonel, assigned to the Army's 106th Cavalry Regiment at Camp Livingston, Louisiana, and in 1943 became commandant of the U.S. Army's Cavalry School in Kentucky, then joined the 70th at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, shortly after. So Peter B. Rhodes, well, I'll get to in a moment. He was a favorite of the artillery people who served under him. As I'll mention, my great-grandfather served under him as well. He was a commanding general of the 70th during the period before they moved from Adair to Fort Leonard Wood. He assumed command when General Dahlquist would leave Oregon and before General Barnett would take over. So he was an artillery officer since World War I in 1917. He began as a a Navy shipman at the Academy at Annapolis, then played on the Navy football team for 3 years, and resigned his commission in 1913. So he came to the 70th in August of 1943 with the 2nd Cavalry Division and the 9th Armored Division. So bottom line is they have these really top tier commanders who are not only they're World War I veterans. It's incredible, the amount of experience that they had, and they are seasoned in every sense of the term. So I can go to the next slide. So training had not, again, waited on the formal organization of the division. By the time that the recruits were already sort of mastering their skills, the remainder of 1943 saw the continued filling out of the division. Training took place at a much more higher degree. They're becoming more proficient on the M1 rifle, the BAR, mortars, light and heavy machine guns, and now organizing howitzer companies as well. So it took some 20 trains and an average of load of 800 men to transport the 70th from Adair to Fort Leonard Wood. And Major General Allison Barnett will take over as new CEO, having just served in the Pacific Theater of Operations. And he was, again, what's great about the 70th is you have such a collection of so many different people from so many different walks of life. You had every one of the 48 states represented there, Puerto Rico, the District of Columbia, even some of the Axis nations were represented in some way, shape, or form. So the original song of the Trailblazers is "Oh Susanna," an unforgettable song, and singing was a big deal to the men and kept spirits up, and you see it in Band of Brothers and other things like that. So quite appropriately, the Missouri start of the Oregon Trail would send the largest contingent, over 1,165 men in addition. So when they were at Fort Leonard Wood, 4 other states, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Texas, and Minnesota, would send an additional 1,000 men. So they're ready. They're young. They're well trained. They're well versed in the art of combat. And again, they've trained in some adverse conditions. They are probably about as prepared as you can possibly be. You can go to the next slide. So when they are at Fort Leonard Wood, my great-grandmother actually remembers seeing, this is where she went to see my great-grandfather off when he went off to Europe. This is a great photograph here of Oliver Hill in front of the 883rd Field Artillery Battalion barracks of Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And I always tell people I don't have any tattoos, but if I was going to get one, that is the exact one I would probably get. If you can't really see it, it's a Latin word on the bottom. It says mortiferum. It means bringer of death or death bringer, loosely translated. So this was the actual.
Yeah, pretty cool.
The actual outfit that my great-grandfather was attached to. And this was such a, I got such a kick out of this when I saw this photograph. So the 3 regiments would then move from Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri to Camp Miles Standish, which is in Taunton, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. And Boston would be their port of embarkation. So the division headquarters went from Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, after being refitted with newly adapted equipment, everything, all the extra preparations and of the units that were going on, all of the activity that was at the ports at the time. The 274th Infantry boarded the Mariposa, which was a former passenger liner, on November 30th, and then the 275th and the 276th would board the SS West Point on December 6th. So the division headquarters would sail on a ship, the Marine Devil. The Trailblazers' first day in Europe was at daybreak at the port of Marseille, France. So the activity was just as intense there. troops were truck loaded into these sort of areas just above Marseille and the CP2, just above the battered city. So there was not a single building left in sight at that point. There were just simple, facilities were slit trenches and really about the most basic outdoor utilities they could possibly have at that point. So the 3 infantry regiments of the 70th, after they land at Marseille, this takes place from the 10th to the 15th of December 1944. They're formed into Task Force Heron after Thomas Heron, and arrival of the remainder of the division will take place on January 18th of 1945. My great-grandfather will be among that group. So the task force Heron would take over the positions along the west bank of the Rhine, if you want to, next slide. And the 28th of December 1944, in the vicinity of Bischweiler, south of the Hagenau forest, elements would take part in stopping the German winter offensive, striking the enemy at Philipsburg and Wingen. And then by mid-January of 1945, the task force would move to an area south of the German city of Saarbrücken, where it would carry out reconnaissance missions, combat patrols, and improvised defensive positions. So fans of Band of Brothers will recall a scene where they had just taken Foy, and they're in that convent in Rasham, and the choir is singing to them. One of the most riveting scenes in that whole series. And the Carwood Lipton character is narrating Donnie Wahlberg's character, and he talks about how they're bound for the town of Mormelon, but then they hear about the Hitler launched a counteroffensive in Alsace, and now those plans have changed. Now they are bound to hold the line at Hagenau. So this is the exact thing he's talking about, and what's known as Operation Nordwind. So again, the 70th is sent there, and the 7th Army was holding the line from Saarbrücken southeastward down to Strasbourg, and it was spread thin at this point. So in one instance, 3 regiments that made up Task Force Harris, the 63rd Division, were actually pulled from the line. The other 2, Task Force Linden, the 42nd, and Task Force Heron, the 70th, took over that sector of their own. And knowing the line was porous, Hitler had planned to hurl as many of his available forces at that particular spot. And the German objective of this plan was to have German troops breaking out of the Colmar pocket, which was some 60 miles to the south, and to cut off the 7th Army from its supply bases. So this sort of patchwork of divisions that's, reconsolidating forces, trying to put forces where they're needed the most. So trying to fill the gaps that's along nearly a 70-mile front is remarkable.
This is kind of the era when the US and the British Army and Canadian armies are kind of rear heavy rather than front heavy, isn't it? This is the era when all the trained battalions are in place, all the ordnance units, all those things, that wonderful ability to move shit around that we need in huge quantities in the ETO. But the actual infantry divisions at the front, there's recruiting, manpower shortages. They're all being expected to do a little bit more than perhaps they should be. And some of them, not in the case of 70, they're getting pretty damn weary of being at the front line. So it's the earlier era of not having enough of anything has kind of been passed. And there's now all this big wealth of power behind the point of the spear. But the point of the spear is a little bit blunt. It blunted.
Yeah, well, exactly. If you can go to the next slide. So they are going to be going up against, and I'll sort of go through each one. The most elite unit they'll face is the 6th SS Division Nord, Mountain Division Nord. They were attacking the Soviet border in central Finland as a part of Operation Arctic Fox in 1941. This also included the 169th Division. One of Nord's infantry divisions, the 9th, was sent to the most northern sector of the Arctic Sea coast. They were the only one to operate there. So they were probably the most prepared as far as dealing with the adverse weather conditions. They were well seasoned, but also at the same time, their ranks had been horribly depleted in fighting on the Eastern Front and during Operation Barbarossa. And the bulk of the division was then sent to the dense forest to attack Soviet positions, and then they would be transferred to fight and participate in Operation Nordwind. So the 256 Volksgrenadier at this point, they are moved into the area of Ludwigswinkel between 28 and 31 December 1944. They also take part in the initial attacks, and in the following days, they will advance slowly, but they will eventually take the heights north of the town of Lichtenberg. During this offensive, they took heavy casualties, and really by the end of January, a very small portion of that division actually remained. So the 361st Volksgrenadier Division, they had also taken part in Operation Nordwind in early January 1945, advancing successfully on their positions on Mutterhaus and Barenthal, and moving as far as Wingen sur Moder and Wiepertsweiler by the 4th of January. And the one division that I really thought was interesting, the 21st Panzer Division, they had seen action at El Alamein and been fighting those desperate battles against a vastly growing number of enemy tanks. They were experiencing heavy losses against the British in those battles, being pushed back from El Alamein, going across Tunisia, Libya. So they are another group that's, again, well seasoned, but they too have had their ranks pretty well depleted by the time that they're transferred to the fighting, driving on Strasbourg and then shifting to the Eastern Front in February of 1945. So they're really not on the scene for all that long. And going further in, it's the 7th Army's offensive was halted by December as a result of the German Ardennes offensive. So the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division was pulled off the line and reorganized, taking part in Operation Nordwind, and were working along with the 21st Panzer Division as well. And in the east, the 7th Army is effectively cut off, and what's the French First Army is operating to the south of them. So this was really what was the goal and the objective of the Germans. They wanted to drive an effective wedge between the United States and the French, and basically release and make contact with other German forces, but really break out of the Colmar pocket. So the German objective, again, this is 60 miles to the south, cutting off the supply bases there along the Rhine, moving Task Force Heron and Linden at this point, move to the German national boundary, to the front lines. There were 3 German divisions there, the 361st Volksgrenadier, the 257th, and the 256th on the left. So their specific objectives were to seize the Beach Sarensburg Road on the right, take Philipsburg, take Dambach on the left, capture Wingen, Wimmenau, Ingwiller, and center to block the Alsatian Plain. So the Panzer divisions would reinforce the infantry there and then link up with more German forces to the Colmar, into the Black Forest, to the Rhine, and then Strasbourg. So the Germans had picked New Year's Eve for the offensive, that believing that the holiday spirit would lower the Americans' guard there. And one of the patrols that went through Philipsburg, almost 2 miles behind American lines, and they had come back into the reports saying there was almost a country-like atmosphere among the Americans there. So much like the attack, of course, of December 16th, 1944, came as a shock and a surprise. So these reports, making their way back to the German commanders, had them so confident that they moved all their troops off the line for special training, except for security forces. The Americans were trying to scramble to get all of their collective, forces together. And after months on the offensive, they now found themselves on the defensive. So the information was explicit. The enemy attack would come on New Year's Eve. All along the line, the soldiers would huddle down for that lonely fighting and frightening event to happen. And this would end up happening with a trip flare exactly 10 minutes before the start of 1945. The flare would go up, and only 50 yards away, they would see German patrols wearing those white parkas, blending in with the snow, crawling towards the Americans, and they would pull their weapons, and Operation Nordwind was underway. So another thing to consider, we talked about the weather. It had been, as we saw in Band of Brothers, it was cold. It was, some days, 30 below zero. Some of the infantry reports that, I saw some of the individuals who wrote diaries about it, and they would purposely put the temperature -3 degrees, -7 degrees, 3 degrees. So another interesting thing to note is this is basically the part of the region that had been bitterly fought over during World War I on the Western Front. The town of Verdun not so far away. So maybe about an hour or two away from this particular section of the battle. So interesting that we are back, fighting along the Western Front, and the two of the 256th Volksgrenadier Division regiments were employed to the town of Philipsburg in the fighting in the first days of Operation Nordwind. So at 0 hour, they were just beginning to get to their forward assembly areas after 2 days of marching there. And after these initial attacks, attacking Neuenhofen and 3 miles northeast of Philipsburg, this was the first day's objective of Operation Nordwind, and making contact with the 476 Grenadiers on the right. So they had no trouble whatsoever. And you can see on the map that the Germans had, in multiple areas along the front lines, had just punched large holes all along from the top, really where for the 44th Infantry was, the 100th Infantry from that particular left flank, ranging all the way down into the lower part of, again, the Colmar pocket. So this was a large, expansive territory that they were going to have to fight through.
This type of campaign by the Germans reminds me of when James Holland says that the Allies have the restrictions of wealth and the Germans have the freedom of poverty, because at this point, we talked about Veritable last week, the Allies, like I said, they've got so much stuff they've got to bring to bear, so much artillery, so much. They're having to think about good, solid road networks and train transportation, all this kind of stuff to move their massive army forward. The Germans, who don't have any of that stuff in depth, what they have got is kind of fairly experienced units that are defending their homeland, want to kind of go on the offensive, who can use the smaller roads, because the Germans don't have to worry about bringing up huge, great, engineering units behind, because they haven't got that stuff. So that freedom of poverty makes for a really interesting clash of doctrines, I suppose, at this point of the war.
Exactly. And as I mentioned, the Germans again have this as well. They concentrate all of their forces. They know this is the very last time that they're going to be able to try to get in.
They're doing exactly what the Allies aren't. They're going for the pinpoint precision punch through, whereas the Allies are, out of necessity and good reason, with good reasons, the broad front strategy of Eisenhower. This is the punch a single hole through and then exploit it.
Yeah, and this again has American commanders scrambling, because you can see by the dotted blue line how far the Germans are able to penetrate and go through the low Vosges and the mountain valleys there. But for the 70th, they're prepared for this, and they will fight back with everything they have once the 3 divisions and the rest of the actual infantry division gets there in January of 1945. So the first major engagement, and the first of 2, I should say, happened almost simultaneously, Philipsburg and Wingen-sur-Moder. So the situation at Philipsburg was becoming desperate in the early phases. Companies I and K of the 275th Infantry Regiment were pinned down on the roads. They had been ambushed during the night. The mission of the 275th was to close the gap between themselves and the 157th Regiment on the right. So part of this line had been covered by the 62nd Armored Infantry. So as they withdrew, a fierce firefight between the 275th and the Germans began. I Company would lose 4 killed, 6 wounded, and 13 missing. So the village of Philipsburg had been adjudged to have been 44% destroyed, primarily by the fighting in January of 1945. And again, it's house-to-house combat. It's desperate fighting. They're getting, the 70th is getting a very hard lesson in the early stages of, again, fighting in mountain valleys is exactly what they're prepared for. But again, you can never be fully prepared of what's going to happen in terms of, house-to-house fighting. They bring their artillery to bear. And again, they are attached to the 45th Infantry Division at this point, because they have been so rapidly depleted by this early advance of Operation Nordwind. At the daybreak of January 3rd, the 361st Volksgrenadier Division, part of Nordwind, launches an attack at Wiepertsweiler, 10 miles to the northeast of Wingen. So the push on Wingen-sur-Moder, this will be the second major area of combat in the Western Front. As I mentioned, the terrain was difficult, steep slopes surrounding this town. The weather, again, as I mentioned, was particularly cruel, waist-high snow drifts in some cases. So the troops attack Wingen, and they will take the village. It's a sort of a back and forth, almost like a heavyweight boxers going back and forth, taking the town and retaking the town again. These photographs I came across. Glenn Callahan took these in late December 2001 and early January 2002. And I'm hoping he contacted the proper authorities before handling these explosives that are clearly have not exploded. So
yeah. Quite a loud bang if that goes off. Yeah.
There's a couple mortars there. As you see some M1 clips, a couple pineapple grenades there. So the German attack had caught the men of the 179th and 276th by surprise, and the entire 179th Battalion headquarters and its support troops had either been killed, wounded, or captured. So 8 officers, 256 enlisted men were taken prisoner and quartered inside the Catholic Church. There were another 30 to 40 placed in a nearby house. So as the morning broke, the Americans had not known, but over the course of the previous night, the main body of the German troops had actually slipped away out of the town and left a sort of a few pockets of resistance going out. So supporting tanks would go through there, blasting house by house. The riflemen would charge in, throwing grenades, and the 274th was taking the town. The 276 was taking the high ground to the north of the town. So after Easy Company had closed on the Catholic Church itself, there were men dashing in there, throwing grenades, and someone said, don't shoot, we're Americans. And thankfully, they didn't fire on them because they were able to free all these POWs. So the men from the 179th Infantry had been able to been held captive in the church without food or water for 4 days. So about 250 men were freed from this. So losses in the 274th were 25 killed, 84 wounded, plus again a number of others, from exposure and other causes. So many of them again hadn't really slept a wink since Nordwind began. So in total, Nordwind on the outset had been a surprise. The German strength had been terribly underestimated by American commanders, and again, the units of the 6th SS Mountain Division were again arguably the best on the Western Front at the time, as good as the 274th and the 276 really were inexperienced. So after Wingen, the German offensive would continue growing with intensity only from the Vosges, going to the Rhine flank, but also nearby the German 19th Army moving southward towards Colmar. So after leaving Wingen, the 2nd Battalion of the 274th proceeded to the Philipsburg area, relieved troops of the 157th Infantry Regiment, 45th Division, and in positions along the Maginot Line near the town of Dambach. And then once again, the 274th had in its 3 infantry battalions together, forming a defensive line eastward from Philipsburg, in which the Germans were not able to penetrate at this point. Local counterattacks kept them off balance, and the Germans kept probing and reconnaissing, and launching reconnaissance missions, but they were not able to resecure these 2 towns, which were crucial for the 70th to retake. And they, again, proved themselves very well in combat in the early phases of Nordwind. So by early February of 1945, the 275th and 276th had arrived at the Saar front, and they had also been assigned to the 15th Corps, the left flank of the 70th, the 7th Army's defensive positions. So the 7th Army's front had ran through northern Lorraine, sort of close to the border of national German territory. And now the Americans can see exactly, they're looking right into Germany from where they're at. And their brother regiment, the 274th Infantry, remained in the low Vosges mountain valley in the vicinity of Biche, and were on January 29th, it had been attached to the 100th Division, and then it reserved elements of the Century Division's deployments in the defensive capacity there. So these 3 regiments can look back upon the first month of January and the last days of 1944 as the period of their trial by fire, their first combat, and they had performed effectively, again, against the 7th Army's successful defense against the German First Army's Nordwind offensive, attached to the 45th Division. So most notably, the 274th was also awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for its outstanding work in Wingen against the German offensive. So upon the arrival of the remainder of the division, Task Force Heron was dissolved, and patrolling continued into February. And I mentioned earlier that on January 18th, 1945, the remainder of the 70th arrives, including a Private First Class Donald Lovelace. I should point out, I know my grandmother's watching. I know I made a mistake. It's Donald G. Lovelace. Donald E. Lovelace was his son. Donald G. Lovelace was, again, born in Pennsylvania. He had, again, left his wife and children at home. He was, again, the ripe old age of, as we talked earlier, about 33 years old. He was attached to the battalion, the Field Artillery Battalion, the 883rd, the service battalion. There was 4 105 millimeter howitzers. He was a part of the service battery. So these photos are great. I love all of them, where he has sort of a sword and a rifle there, a couple spoils of war. The last one with his field glasses there, and again, doing some observing as a part of the 883rd Field Artillery Battalion. The middle one is the one that always gets me. I always sort of look at this one and say, you know what, this is probably a point in the war where he's just kind of reflecting. He kind of has that look about him. He's sitting on a couple of jerry cans there and just pondering, gathering his thoughts in. And I always found this one particularly, moving and emotional, and what must have been going through his mind there. But he would obviously survive the war. He would come home and he would serve as an engineer on the railroad in a town called Northampton, Pennsylvania. It's for many of my relatives are from there. My grandmother's aunts, cousins, uncles. It's going through there, it still has that World War II kind of feel to it. It's a very small town, concrete. It's the Atlas Cement Company was the major industry there, and it just still retains almost that that World War II kind of feel to it in every way, with the architecture and everything else there. So that is my great grandfather's story from the 70th Infantry Division.
Fantastic.
So the next major city and the last major French border city, again, as we're pushing towards Germany, will be Forbach. And on their positions, and the regiments of the 70th would confront a series of uneven hills and uncovered draws, a network of valleys, of road networks that would connect many of the towns and villages, as you see on the map here. So multiple entrenchments extend along the southern and southeastern slopes of the ridge system. It is a heavily wooded area. Belts of anti-tank ditches and obstacles are also in this particular zone. A secondary line of entrenchments from Kerbach to Lissing along the Saar River. And on February 1st of 1945, in a gray mist, a foggy morning, the 70th would surge forward, fighting for the first time as a complete division. They would again begin this drive on the eventual capture of Saarbrücken. And the advance was slowed by mines, by pillboxes that were now dotting the Siegfried line, which again was deemed as impassable in many respects. So after the liberation of Oeting, the immediate objective of the 276th was Forbach, was a well-defended French mining center near Saarbrücken. To reach Forbach, the Trailblazers had to overcome high ground at Kleinwald, which was covered by thick woods. Also, the ancient Schlossberg Castle, which was a towering above a steep hill overlooking the entire town. You literally have a 360-degree view from up there. It was, again, well protected, a narrow valley which the GIs had a very limited room to traverse and get up those slopes to get there.
And so real different in terms of intelligence gathering.
Yeah.
I've been reading about this in the past. Really difficult for the US to predict how much fight some of these towns had them in them. Are they are they kind of French? Are they German? Where's their loyalty? Where,
Exactly.
have they had members of the family who served in the French army in the First World War and the German army in the Second World War? That kind of thing. I've been to places like Aachen with Phil Blood, where you've got people who fought for Belgium in the First World War for the Allies, against the Allies. It's a very unpredictable area in terms of knowing what's going to, they could be fiercely defending, or they could be willing to be liberated. It blurs the line between conquest and liberation, doesn't it, Alsace-Lorraine?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you simply don't know where loyalties lie with all of these different sort of emotions.
And indeed, the people there themselves are probably changing their mind, as I would be if I was living there. Okay, what's your motivation is obviously often the saving of your own family, as opposed to your wider loyalties. And what's best for me this week when shells are falling? It's a complicated time, and we don't talk enough about it.
There was a great point that I read that this particular region on the French-German border had been contested going back to the 1870 71.
Yeah, Andreas just said that in the sidebar. The contested from 1871 to 1945.
Back to the Franco-Prussian War, and there was a great statistic that said if you were at least 50 years old, your flag had changed at least one time. Again, you have the results of World War I, and then it goes back and forth. The French try to retake it, then the Germans will, especially in the Saarland, as I'll get to momentarily, that was considered holy ground to the Germans and Hitler. So the advance on Forbach had been slow. They had its sights set on Schlossberg Castle, and again, the rugged heights were practically void of cover. The regiment went up the slopes. They surprised at the outset when they really failed to draw fire. The men quickened the pace up the slopes. They reached the castle and then discovered that the Nazis had completely pulled out altogether. They'd withdrawn into the city itself. So this imposing, towering structure didn't prove not to be such a big obstacle. So once they gained control of the castle, the Germans would again fight back fiercely. Nebelwerfers, they would be running up the slopes in pitch darkness. Company I of the 276, entrenched or at the base of the 500-year-old castle, rose out of the rock, and they would fight back in the direction of any sound that was made. So the Nazis' small arms and automatic weapons fire had began to diminish. Mortar fire and artillery shells began to pour in. The Trailblazers would then move into Forbach itself from Schlossberg Castle, and then surging ahead, battling house to house. Enemies again will be mortaring, shelling. They would be fighting intense, and this was the last major French town to be liberated from the Germans as they moved in. So on February 21st, they're still fighting house to house in 276. They are now moving further and further into Forbach. They would take 100 prisoners, their highest one-day catch. The weather continued to hold out. It was very good. They began to get resupplied. So the next day, as day turns into night, they began to use searchlights to observe targets and observe enemy troop movements. So their advance into the mountains and the forests and the ridges around Forbach, again, they had to fight vicious enemy guerrilla counterattacks, and they were to hold railroad lines, defensive lines. Forbach was proving to be about the toughest fight that they had, but the toughest fighting was about to they were about to encounter it. So by March 2nd, the 274th Infantry had captured the mountains around Forbach, and then on March 3rd, they attacked across the railroad, 1st Battalion on the right and 3rd Battalion on the left. Riflemen would then assault the companies entrenched and capture the houses and the respective sectors, and again, less than 10 minutes after crossing the line of departures. So Forbach was captured, and again, a bitter fight there. But now we are now moving into the second phase at this point, known as the Battle of the Ridges. Two particular towns, Spicheren and Stiring-Wendel. The operations beginning there on February really 16th, going into the first days of March of 1945. the 274th was ordered to hold the Spicheren Gap at all costs and assist the 275th Infantry in driving the Germans out of Gifterwald and then capturing the town of Stiring-Wendel. So they would now drive into these towns and now continuing clearing out Forbach as well. And instead of having to move directly from this area, they hold Spicheren Heights. And as you see on the map here, it's literally ringed with hills and valleys where the Germans have the high ground, and they are, again, having to sort of one by one move from town to town, and while encircling the German troops there. So as they approach Stiring-Wendel, the German guards would flee. It would allow the Allied prisoners to escape. Many of them were taken prisoner at this point. There would be many POWs that they would come across from crippled, from disease, from suffering, from malnutrition. POWs began streaming into the 274th positions. So one of the more famous incidents that happens at Stiring-Wendel, if you go to the next slide, is they will liberate a number of POWs from this area that were from Italian, Romanian, Russian. It's sort of a mixed group of POWs that they come across, and they'll, the 70th now has to sort of shift their focus from not only fighting, but what they're going to do with all of these prisoners. So as I mentioned, that once they take the Spicheren Heights, the Germans can contrive every device available to defend this sacred soil, and rotating and elevating pillboxes were there, mortars, artillery, cascading fire from all directions, and counter battery fire proved to be quite effective. And again, the weather playing a decisive factor, that the low ceiling would prevent any air support to to help resupply them. So savage fighting raged as the Trailblazers now wrestled the Spicheren Heights from the Germans. Company B of the 274th was digging in after a tough battle, and now the Germans were now trying to counter-assault and push back on the town. The 276 would storm through there. It would take some time for the 70th to sort of regather itself. They were sort of stretched thin at this point. At this point, they would capture 18 towns, 2,034 prisoners of war, and repulsed over 29 counterattacks. So its actions would produce such accolades as issued by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery while decorating Captain Joseph Donahue, no relation, of Rolla, Missouri, Company I-275th, who awarded the Silver Star for gallantry, I should say, an action at Spicheren, and said to British, the famous general, that he wanted to pay tribute to the gallantry of the American soldier. He is an excellent fighting man, quote unquote. So to get that kind of recognition from someone like Bernard Montgomery must have been a tremendous morale boost.
He's mostly good at congratulating himself rather than other people. To be fair. But
so that was one of those rare, humble moments that you have from Montgomery.
A broken clock is right twice a day. So Montgomery can be compassionate and nice and caring. I mean, I'm a fan of Montgomery, just not as a human being particularly. But
So as again they're starting to push through, this particular photograph I thought was just tremendous. I didn't even notice until later on that he's sitting on top of one of the bent propellers of the number 3 engine there. And as you can see, this Fortress, the B-17 Flying Fortress crew, did a remarkable job. They found a nice, wide, open, flat piece of land to crash land on. But as you can see, the Germans have picked this thing pretty much clean. The fiberglass is gone. The guns have been stripped out. The nose glass, the top turret, all that stuff. So the 70th is now making its way into German territory, and it's only a matter of time now until the final battle is going to be.
I mean, by March now, the roller coaster is on its way. The boulder is rolling. I mean, the January, February period where the Germans are still to some extent dictating the plays and doing their counter-offensives is kind of in the past now. We're now everybody is now crashing into Germany, into over the Rhine, all the other points now. So it's not that there isn't lots of tough fighting ahead, but the momentum is now getting back into the Allies.
Yeah, that's exactly it. All the momentum is on the Allied side at this point. So the 70th Division was now ordered to spearhead the 7th Army's attack through the Siegfried Line to capture Saarbrücken, and the 276th Infantry would attack on the left. The 275th would be on the right, and an aerial bombardment. Saarbrücken had been bombed really since the outset of the war. The RAF and the U.S. Army Air Forces were, again, they had pretty much reduced the city to almost complete rubble. And another aerial bombardment on the afternoon of March 16th would then proceed. The jump-off point, a battalion of medium tanks would now be attached to the division as well. So they were, as you can see on the map, literally like almost you're in Vegas. You're putting all your chips, everything, and shoving it up on the table and saying, okay, we're going to go all in here, and this is going to be, the final. There's almost a destiny, if you will, that the 70th was going to attack this particular sector of the war. So, in terms of importance to the Nazis, the Saar Basin was a heavily industrialized area known for its coal mines, and they were vital to German iron and steel industries. So, after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles had placed the Saar Basin under the control of the League of Nations. And with this, the 1935 plebiscite was held, and the Saar region overwhelmingly voted to rejoin Germany, and the move that Hitler saw as validation of his policies, and now to undermine the Treaty of Versailles even more and strengthen Germany's resolve. There's photos and footage of him driving through Saarbrücken, cheering crowds, making speeches there. So this was considered to be holy ground to the Nazis. So the 70th is positioned to the south of the city, engaging in preparatory action for the opening of this offensive. German counterattacks would delay the assault, but at 15:10 hours on March 15th, there would be 5 battalions of American artillery beginning to fire a 20-minute preparatory artillery bombardment of the city. The fire was lifted, and then another 20-minute preparation was fired after that. So for the next few days, there was sort of patrolling and sort of skirmishing. The division tank and artillery fired hundreds and expended hundreds of missions and expended 5,000 rounds, neutralizing enemy gun batteries along the Siegfried Line. If you go to the next slide. So this particular one here is a remarkable photo. These guys are literally mid-sprint going into the town of Svering-Wendell. And on March 20th, 1945, the 274th Infantry would begin to make their spearhead and the assault crossing the Saar River. You can go to the next slide. And this is a photograph, as I mentioned, once they capture Stiring-Wendell, the 1,200 prisoners that they capture, that are liberated there, a Russian, Yugoslav, Italian. There are others that, that have been, they were, as you can see, they were not in good condition health-wise. The Germans simply, just mistreated these, men. And again, they were captured probably in the early phases, in the mid phases of the war. So this was one of the more famous actions that the 70th had executed was the liberation of these towns, and by the end of it, there will be many of them that will fall to the 70th and many of its support units. So on March 20th of 1945, the 274th would then spearhead the assault across the Saar River and race around Saarbrücken to make contact with the Germans. And operations would continue with the 70th moving forward to Mainz, to Wiesbaden, to Frankfurt am Main. And the 70th would then perform occupation duties in this area while guarding key bridges across the Rhine River. So Saarbrücken would be, a tough fight. There would be, they were tasked with a very difficult, objective, and capturing a large city. But as I mentioned on the map, you saw that they were again putting all their resources on to all on one sort of front there, and as the Germans are beginning to have their backs against, be pushed against the wall, they are going to be fighting with even greater resistance, and artillery was going to be a decisive factor in this as well. So as I mentioned, the 882nd, 883rd, and 884th Light Artillery Battalions, including my great-grandfather's unit, 883rd, also the 725th Medium Artillery, under the control of command of Peter P. Rhodes, would help secure the Saarbrücken bridgehead. And on March 20th, one of the division artillery shells had severed the lines leading to German demolition charges under the famed Saarbrücken Bridge. When the Nazis attempted to blow the span, the charges failed to detonate, and accurate fire would end up keeping the Germans from restoring the demolition system. So this is really the next really big story for the 70th, that they really break through the Siegfried line. And again, it is a formidable obstacle. There are pillboxes, blockhouses, machine gun nests all over, mines everywhere. So the assault is not going to come very easily to them.
This is a combination of everything they're having to do now. It's urban warfare, fighting for mountainous terrain, high ground, all the skills they have been learning over the previous 2 years being put to the test there, and then attacks on fixed positions. And the fact you're talking about the use of artillery, it sounds really amazing, of course, but I guess there's not that much air power around, because everything is going on at the same time now. So air power, everybody wants air power from the top of the line right up near the sort of the channel, right the way down to kind of the lower part of the attack into Germany. So I suppose it's although it's great to have artillery, it would be nice to have some fighter bombers as well.
Yeah, and of course, fighter cover and airdrops were indeed limited, as obviously the Bander brothers you saw there, and that was the case. And there was the weather was just still not very favorable.
Yeah,
low ceiling. They could not get anything in, and on the few days that they were actually get breaks in the weather, they would get all of the you had everything at your disposal at that point in terms of air power. So they would cross into the Saar, make contact with the Germans, and again, after mopping up operations, they would move into the city. They would have to patrol, look for snipers, and again, this vicious house-to-house fighting that you see, as you can see evidenced by this photograph. The town has just been shelled. Fighting is house to house. It's intense. And the 70th, again, they are really well seasoned. They know how to fight in these, narrow alleyways, in the streets, in the corners. They know how to move. They're a well coordinated and well oiled machine at this particular part of World War II. All of this training that they had experienced at Adair, Fort Leonard Wood, and really the experience that they have, bonding with each other. The regiments have been fighting really right at the beginning of the Ardennes offensive. Really on the eve of it, they arrive and they are rushed to the lines again to the against Operation Nordwind.
It's interesting. You've referenced Band of Brothers a couple of times, but I think in some ways you could liken this campaign more to the Pacific, in that you're not getting the grateful civilians coming out thanking you for liberation. This isn't the Netherlands, this isn't Belgium, it's not France, where the girls are coming out giving you kisses, and the little kids are asking for chocolate. This is Germany now. This is German border country, where they're, as we're now firmly into Germany now, we kind of left the French bit behind. They're stubbornly defending. This is where, there's a kid round the corner with a Panzerfaust, theoretically. There's booby traps. And so the fact that they're drawing on this morale they had of working together for a long time, because they're not going to get many moments going through that city to kind of boost their ego, so to speak. It's going to be danger around every corner, so you're going to have to rely on your own mates for support and for keeping the morale up.
Yeah, and I guess, as you mentioned before, they being uncertain of who's who and what their intentions are.
Yeah,
and you're right in the center of, again, Nazi holy ground. And this is, I always found this particular photograph telling. And as you mentioned, it's not Belgium, where they're running up to you, throwing flowers, kissing you all over the place. You're getting the blank stares of the German people watching you on either side.
Phil Blood is in the sidebar, and he could go off on a massive tangent about where Hitler got his votes from, but the industrial heartlands are kind of important to him, the working class people. So, these aren't. These I would imagine Saarbrücken would be a fairly loyal Nazi area. Phil Blood will come in and correct me in the side, but if I'm wrong on that. So
he's absolutely right.
Watch your step. You've got to watch your step going in.
Because as I mentioned earlier, that when the citizens of Saarbrücken vote to be reincorporated into the Reich, it's over 90% of the people there vote for it.
Yeah.
So that's the loyalty that you're seeing there. And again, you're driving through this city, and again, these piles of rubble. It had been attacked, bombed all throughout the war, and now the Americans are going through there, and again, it's a much different experience. And as they'll find out as they go through,
these are amazing photos as well.
Really good. And like I said, the archive that the 70th Infantry has, again, it's Trailblazers WWII.org. There's striking photos. You see the scale of the damage and the rubble, and the civilians and how how they're affected by it, and also at the same time you see evidence of a truly effective American fighting unit at its peak strength. That all of the training, all of this is culminated into this really. It was almost like I mentioned before. It was almost destined for the 70th Infantry to attack this particular city, just because of its history, the topography, all of the fighting that they do, all the different complexities of every city they liberate. And it's a remarkable story how they are able to, from the time they arrive in France and the time that they arrive, they liberate Saarbrücken, it's almost about as flawless. I mean, war is always flawed. You're always going to have issues, problems. I mean, once bullets and artillery and bombs start exploding, you never know what's going to come of it. But they are well disciplined. They're at this point in the war, pretty well seasoned. They're a few months in. They've been fighting pretty consistently from all of January and most of February.
And I'm glad you were talking about the time aspect, because it's easy for us to view time in different ways. When you're looking at, for example, the US 3rd Division that was in the line for whatever it was, 3 years overseas, or some of the British units that were fighting from 40 to 45, to go, well, a unit like this only quote unquote did a couple of months fighting at this point. But then look at what happened to the British 1st Airborne Division after 9 days at Arnhem. They were absolutely spent after these guys, as you've made the point. This has been 2 months of consistent fighting by this point. So, it's not as long as other people have spent in the line, but 2 months of intensive combat fighting into Germany is good. We need to get away from this idea that these units that came in at the end are just mopping up and just sort of seeing it through to VE Day. Now the hard fighting is over. It's absolutely not the hard fighting over.
Yeah.
So the 70th again they will secure the town towards the end of March of 1945, and as I mentioned, the Germans are attempting to blow the bridges. The American engineers are sent in there, and credit to the engineers all throughout the campaign, not only in Operation Nordwind, but also during the Ardennes offensive and launched on December 16th of 44. The engineers do things, especially to try and keep the Germans off their heels, trying to roadblocks, and you have all different methods that they use to try and blunt any kind of movement. It is a credit to them. Building bridges, they do things that are just vital to the supply lines to keep them moving, because if you have that disappear, then you're pretty much dead in the water. So a testament to them, and Saarbrücken is really the culmination of all of this effort, all of this training, and the 70th will pretty much put their stamp on this particular pocket of fighting in this sector, and this will be pretty much the exclamation point on their campaign there. Great photo here. One of the Nazi flags that they capture, I have a picture of it. It was actually signed by a number of the men of the 883rd, my great-grandfather's artillery battalion. Saarbrücken, the 883rd written on and everything. So This again was, their first and only drive into German territory. They had been fighting for all of these sort of French border towns and trying to liberate them one by one, and then that final decisive battle into the largest city that they had taken at that point. For all the logistics, for all of the organization, the command, they knew that this was going to be, the 70th destiny. They knew that this was going to be, the ultimate fight. This was going to define the 70th legacy in sum total. So just a few of the men who were lost at the 70th. You have Frank Jaskowitz, who was killed in the fighting in just before they jumped off into Saarbrücken on March the 6th of 1945. Francis Jordan there as well. The next slide is another individual who I found pretty interesting. This is Jimmy Butler. Jimmy, I found out, was a Hollywood actor, a child actor, probably the most famous trailblazer. He was from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He was attached to the sister battalion, my great-grandfather's, the 82nd Field Artillery Battalion. He was an actor in the 30s and the 40s. He had done 35 films right up until 1943. He had earned acclaim in his role in a film called Only Yesterday, which was in 1933. His screen debut. He got another boost in playing a character Jim Wade in Manhattan Melodrama. He later played one of the protagonists in a film called No Greater Glory. So when Butler is going into World War II, on 17 February 1945, he took over a radio operator after he became ill, grabbed the radio, left a observation post in order to provide artillery support in the attack on Forbach, France. So joining the advanced elements of the company F-274th Infantry, he carried the radio from one vantage point to another, observed under constant mortar fire and artillery fire, automatic weapons fire, and again, just running across wherever he can get a signal. And while he was performing this mission, he would be killed on the battlefield. This reminded me of like an Audie Murphy kind of story, like a Jimmy Monteith on June 6, 1944 in WN60. Again, leading those Shermans up that path, and again he would lose his life as well. So pretty remarkable story there.
Absolutely.
So the total, they were in the line for 86 consecutive days of combat. They would liberate 58 towns, take 668 prisoners, and again, penetrating the Siegfried Line, moving towards the Saarland. They would lose 835 killed in action, 2,713 wounded, 397 taken as prisoners, 54 missing in action, and they would be extremely, rewarded in terms of decorations. Distinguished Unit Citation, 12 DSCs, 228 Silver Stars, 430 Bronze Stars, 21 Air Medals, 7 Legion of Merits, Military Cross from the United Kingdom. So the 70th, as I mentioned before, they perform admirably. And once the division would leave Europe in August of 1945 after brief occupation duty, they would be deactivated on October 11th, 1945 at Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. In the 1950s, the 70th Infantry training would be formed as part of the Organizational Reserve Corps, later the Army Reserve. They would continue until they were inactivated in 1996. They would then be known as the 70th Regional Service Command, and then the 70th Regional Readiness Command. And then in 2007, I think they were known as the 70th RRC. They were inactivated, I think, in 2008. The 70th Division Training, which was the functional training, was activated, and they are the unit that carries the 70th colors to this day, based out of Fort Knox, Kentucky. So again, when I started to do research on this, and it was obviously because of my great-grandfather's service there, and as you mentioned, we talked earlier, when you're researching a lot of these units, it's either feast or famine. It's like you're going to find nothing, or you're going to find everything and anything. And, I was so lucky and fortunate to be able to, find all of these great, documents, photos, resources. Huge amount of respect and thank you goes to everyone that, works on that, this Trailblazers website, Trailblazers, www.org. And again, the pride that you feel as you researching this and knowing that your great grandfather was in amongst this fighting and seeing that those photographs of him there really drives it home, and it kind of added that a little bit of emotional sweetness to it.
I mean, it's been the knowledge has been just insane all the way through it. So thanks for that, and it's wonderful just hearing about something that all of us are, I'm sure, going to admit we should know more about. I mean, Peter Caddick Adams in his final book of his trilogy kind of covered the era of this fighting, and he paid honor to quite a few of these units. But there's nothing like following one particular unit through their, so 86 days of combat. Again, it reminds us not to compare league tables of divisions by length of time in service or how many campaigns. You can learn a certain amount for that, but as Medi Doctor said there, that that's going to be a 20-25% casualty rate in a division like that. So that's pretty for an era when most people would consider, well, again, the war's done and dusted. That's a lot of people killed and wounded and captured in a period when the end is clear. The end of the war the outcome is certain, but there's still got to be fighting done to get there.
Yeah, and I wanted to also extend a great thank you to the great people at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. I actually did a bunch of research there back in October. My cousin and I went down to Gettysburg for a couple of days and drove up there, and they had so many, they had boxes and boxes full of research and archives. I was like, okay, I'm not leaving. This is going to be, going to be here for a while, and just poured over those documents. And it was, the great folks there and everywhere I've researched, and everyone in the history world there is just so gracious and so helpful. And this was no exception. It was extremely helpful to my research, and I'm glad. I hope everyone enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did. But I just have to ask you, what you got on your hoodie there? Does that say what I think is?
Norwich. So
it's not the ones I hate. I mean,
no, I had a feeling you were going to ask me.
No, we're talking about the American versions.
Norwich is actually a military. It's actually the birthplace of the ROTC. This is where I got my master's degree in military history in 2011. The great folks up there, I still talk to quite a few of them. It's a great school, and they have military history majors there, and it's such a great program.
Because if you were a Brit and you came on with a Norwich hoodie, to me, an Ipswich fan, that would be, that's poking.
It was done on purpose at the same time. I thought you would appreciate that.
I thought I half noticed it, and then I just thought I got into the swing of World War II.
Yes, but it's in Northfield, Vermont, by the way.
Okay, we got a pumped 4-2 by Nottingham Forest this afternoon. Anyway, folks, if you're watching this and you're someone who has a relative in one of the, let's say, less renowned units, but undeservedly less renowned, then please do get in touch, because it's fairly easy finding experts on the 101st, the 82nd, the Big Red One, and I enjoy covering those units as I do covering the British 1st and 6th Airborne. But there's something about kind of the treading the path of these units that don't get the same amount of attention, because you feel like you're honoring people who don't get as much time in the spotlight. And it's, we're not blaming Band of Brothers. We're not blaming video games. They're all very important in where we are today, but it's just nice to spread the love around a bit and remind ourselves that people from all over the world in very different units brought the end to the Nazis regime in Europe. So, good.
Yeah, well said. Well said. I totally agree. And again, this was, as I mentioned to you, a labor of love, and having the knowledge of my great grandfather's time and service there with the 70th, and being able to tell that story to everybody. I hope everyone enjoyed it.
They did. And so, folks, we're kind of getting into Germany next week. Monique is back on again. She's only on a couple of weeks ago talking about gliders in Burma. She's talking about gliders in Varsity. Christopher Jarry is talking about the British pushing into Germany. We've got John Caratola coming back on again, talking about the crossing of the rivers. We got Kevin Hiemel coming on, talking about Patton getting across the Rhine. So it's all about that final push into Germany over the next few days, and lots more stuff coming up. So as always, click like and subscribe. But I'm off to the pub with Colin, everybody. So I haven't seen him for a few days, so that's good. So thanks everybody for your support. Thanks for the questions. I'll see you all on Monday. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
Bye. Where's my mouse gone?